But you know how
I was wondering how we were going to do the setup, but I guess
Have
this
to,
makes sense.
yeah, share a little bit. I suppose I'll go.
Carlos, we ready? All right. Good morning, everybody. It is 9:02. We're going to go ahead and get our workshop started. I'd like to welcome everybody to the Government Services Building and our county facility. So today is Wednesday, March 20th, 2024. This is the Flagler County Board of County Commissioners and City of Palm Coast and Flagler County Sheriff's Office joint workshop to discuss a 5-year work plan. It is 9:02 a.m. If everybody could join me and stand for the pledge. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Thank you, everybody. We also take this time for a brief moment of silence. This is for individual prayer, reflection, or meditation. We take this time to honor and remember our first responders and the men and women in our military who keep us safe and protect our freedoms at home and abroad. Thank you all. All right, again, I want to welcome everybody, and we'll go ahead and get started on the 5-year public safety plan. I'm going to pass this off to our administrators to go through the presentation. So Ms. Petito and Ms. Johnson, who wants to take the lead?
I think we were going to kind of present this, but we wanted the sheriff to just start with a couple words. Thank you.
Sure, absolutely. Morning, Sheriff.
Mayor, and distinguished elected officials. I just want to kind of kick this off. I'm Flagler County Sheriff Rick Staley for the official record. And you may recall back when Commissioner O'Brien was the chairman of the Board of County Commissioners, we tried to have a joint city-county commission meeting back then on what we're going to talk about today. And it never really materialized for a variety of reasons. And I've been an advocate of this joint meeting because public safety not only is important, but it needs to be funded. And as a sheriff, I'm kind of caught in the middle between the county commission and the city of Palm Coast with competing interests on who is responsible for the service level for specifically law enforcement in Flagler County. And that was the impetus for this meeting, along with the studies that we had previously commissioned on staffing needs of the sheriff's office and the growth. So that's what brought us here today. I know that our three bodies, staffs, the county administrator, my staff, and the city of Palm Coast staff have been intimately involved in probably close to a year of meetings, I would guess, in working for the presentation today. And I specifically want to commend Lauren Johnson, because she really took the lead on what you're going to see today. And she took the studies that we had done, and she could be a high-paid consultant right now on manpower, staffing studies for law enforcement across the country. She's just done a phenomenal job putting this together as the tip of the spear, but working with the staff. So, you know, this is a fast growth county, as you know, and the quality of life depends on the first responders in there. So that's what I have to say to help kick it off. And Heidi, do you want to take it from there or turn it over to Lauren?
I'll turn it over to Lauren. Thank you.
Thank you, Sheriff.
Good morning. Good morning, Mayor and City Council members, Board Chair Dance, and Flagler County Commissioners. I'm Lauren Johnston, Assistant City Manager with the City of Palm Coast. I'm joined with Chief of Staff Mark Strobridge of the Flagler County Sheriff's Office. If you recall, in spring of last year, Sheriff Staley sent a letter to the Board of County Commissioners and the City of Palm Coast City Council. The request was for the elected bodies to work together and develop a long-term funding and staffing plan, an agreement between the two bodies to effectively meet the growing needs of our county and city. In 2022, the Sheriff's Office received a Community-Oriented Policing Service, COPS grant from the U.S. Department of Justice to conduct a more in-depth law enforcement staffing study using the mixed methodology analyst approach. We're here today to review the data of the study, discuss an approach to fund future growth by establishing a calls for service metric, and discuss the need for funding deficit staffing. Strategic vision alignment between the Flagler County and the City of Palm Coast is paramount for the effective and efficient delivery of essential services, particularly in the realm of public safety. By synchronizing our objectives and strategies, both we can ensure a cohesive approach to serving our community and maintaining public safety. Shared goals enable better resource allocation, coordination of efforts, and the ability to address emerging challenges collaboratively. Moreover, alignment fosters trust and transparency of the county and city administrations, enhancing communication channels and facilitated joint decision-making. Ultimately, a unified strategy vision not only optimizes the use of taxpayer resources, but also reinforces the commitment of Flagler County and the City of Palm Coast safeguarding their residents and fostering a secure and thriving environment. Residents do not perceive boundary lines when it comes to the services provided to them by local government. Our community's approach to delivering law enforcement services occurs through three main avenues: the City of Palm Coast contract, the Sheriff Services countywide, and county-supported services. And I've identified those here. This report relates to the methods and outcomes of staffing analysis performed for the Flagler County Sheriff's Office that was oriented around three objectives. One, optimize a new mixed method law enforcement staffing analysis model with measurement refinements, site-based data collection, and in addition, notes methodology enhancements. Number two, administer the new model of empirically specify the immediate and near future hiring needs of the Sheriff's Office. And number three, demonstrate the utility of the model for other agencies' staffing needs. At present, deputies spend majority of their shift work responding to calls for service. So what is calls for service? Anytime there is a request for assistance by members of the community to law enforcement. These calls vary widely and encompass incidents such as emergencies, accidents, crimes in progress, suspicious activities, and other situations where the public seeks help of law enforcement. Calls for service are a fundamental aspect of police work, as they represent the direct interaction between law enforcement and the community that they serve. So let's get into the data. The mixed methodology analyzed a series of steps. Step one was evaluating and examining the distribution of calls for service by hour, day, month. Calls for service, or CFS, are collected and evaluated based on hour, day, and month to identify temporal trends in demand for service. For the purpose of this study, the report looked at citizen-initiated calls for service. The report also indicated data from 2019 to 2020. And the reason why this was collected, even though the study was done in 2022, was that they wanted to take a real snapshot before the pandemic. And if you'll look at our trends from 2019 to 2020 to last fiscal year, 2022-2023, our call volume has increased. Now, the difference between citizen-initiated calls for service and total calls for service, the delta there is total calls for service includes community policing, and we'll discuss that further. The second step is calculation of deputy time in minutes and hours responding to calls for service. Examining the nature of calls for service identifies the call type, examples there being traffic collision, assault investigation, 911 call, to specify the workload demand for different types of calls for service. Also, estimated time consumed for calls for service determines the length of each call for service, including response time, duration on scene, time expenditure, and associated administrative tasks. From our data collection here, we evaluated a 24-hour period. While deputies most likely work in different shifts, for the purpose of this report, we looked at 24 hours. The average deputy time for calls for service was 121 minutes. Next, we look at a calculation of deputy time in minutes and hours that is addressing calls for service. The current staffing analysis offers an enhancement by adding a multiplier for deputies responding for calls for service, time estimated for those calls for service that included more than one deputy who attended the call. So many times if you're driving by, you'll see a couple of deputies working one call. That calculation is included in this report. Next is minimum deputies required by shift varying performance objectives. Agencies should establish performance objectives that reflect their community and agency. While conducting and calculating agency shift relief factor, a shift relief factor is the number of days a deputy can actually work. Establishing performance objectives. Establishing it by agency performance objectives are the amount of time a deputy shift is devoted to different work types. Examples there being calls for service, police community relations, and administrative tasks. Measures these times expenditures determined by optimizing focus group interview responses. So this data not only focused on qualitative, but also quantitative measures. What this chart is showing you is that you have different performance objectives to how the deputies are responding to calls for service, and how many of them do you want obligated to calls for service. As I mentioned before, we'll discuss the community policing. Community policing is a philosophy and strategy in law enforcement that emphasizes positive building relationships and partnerships between law enforcement officers and the communities that they serve. The goal of community policing is fostering collaboration, open communication, and mutual trust between law enforcement agencies and the people they protect and serve. In community policing approach, law enforcement seeks to engage proactively with the community, not just reactively in response for calls for service. Officers work to establish relationships, understand community needs, and address underlying issues that may contribute to criminal activity. Establishing these lines of communication between law enforcement and the community is crucial. When community members feel comfortable communicating with the police, they are more likely to report issues and cooperate in crime prevention efforts. Community policing often involves using data and information to identify patterns, assess community needs, allocate resources effectively. This data-driven approach can help prioritize responses to calls for service and addressing reoccurring issues. I want to commend Sheriff Staley and his community outreach efforts and those positive public programs. Next is determining the minimum number of deputies per shift by performance objectives, including the shift relief factor and factoring in those obligated times for calls for service. So this is the meat and potatoes. So not only are you calculating how much time that needs to be spent for a shift relief factor due to days off like vacation, training, and other time making deputies unavailable for dispatch, the shift relief factor also allows agencies to know how many deputies are required to ensure basic services. And then again, we know that that 67.5% obligated is what our current level of service is now. So by analyzing all of this data, we wanted to produce that calls for service metric, meaning how can we analyze the calls that come in each year, set a baseline for calls for service, and then take that number and calculate how many deputies are needed next fiscal year for budget purposes. Chief Strobridge and I have calculated by taking each 6 step of the methodology and analysis of calls for service divided by minimum number of deputies per shift and shift relief factor equals 1 deputy sheriff for every 308 calls for service. So a great example of how this would work is if the calls for service were 43,375, and then the next year you saw an increase of 2,700 calls for service. We would take that 2,700 calls for service, divide it by 308, and you would get your 8 deputies. Since 2019, Flagler County's population has increased by 1,500 residents, which is slightly over 14% growth. That equates to just an average of 4,000 additional residents annually. 2 different data sources were selected to forecast population figures. Illustrated, the Office of Economic and Demographic Research shows a growth of 147,960 by 2030, which is a 13.1% increase over 2023. This slide, which utilizes the Bureau of Economic Business and Research, BEBR, shows a population estimate of 2030 of, 147,960. This estimate brings us to almost 3,000 new residents annually. That indicates while the population growth could be between 3,000 to 5,000. Oftentimes, the per capita approach is used to compare municipalities and governments on law enforcement needs. The per capita approach is often used for comparison purposes. The IACP, International Association of Chief of Police model, recommends a staffing ratio of 2.4 deputies per 1,000 residents. This model suggests that for every 1,000 individuals in a community, there should be 2.4 law enforcement deputies available to provide adequate coverage and maintain public safety. This staffing ratio is designed to calculate law enforcement agencies have the minimum personnel to respond to emergencies, conduct patrols, investigate crimes, and address community concerns. However, there are some limitations to using the per capita approach to law enforcement. The approach does not consider essential differences within a jurisdiction, such as environmental conditions, how deputies spend their time, community demographics, officer deployment, intensity of workload, crime levels, policing styles, and more. The FBI states on their policing employee data webpage, law enforcement differing service requirements and functions, as well as varied demographic traits and characteristics of jurisdictions, use caution when drawing comparisons between agency staffing levels. The data reference here, the lower line on the chart represents population in unincorporated Flagler County. The blue line, the next blue line, represents city population. The green line represents county population as a whole. And the above green line represents the number of law enforcement needed in the agency per the IACP model. With all that being said, understanding crime rate. Crime rate is very different. Crime rate is going down. Sheriff Staley has echoed that it is really great in our community. We continue to see it trend downward as population grows. Well, crime rate is calculated by only these associated crimes that you see on the screen. We also know that crime rate is going down because our population is getting older. Based off the 2010 and 2020 census shown on the chart, our crime rate shows our population trends. Sheriff Staley has done an excellent job leveraging technology to enhance public safety efforts and reduce cost. Many of you are familiar with the Real-Time Crime Center as well as Silent Guardians. Also, Sheriff Staley has initiated the inmate rehabilitation program to help with the transition of these residents. So the need. In analyzing the data for this study, the Sheriff's Office in 2020 needed 141 law enforcement officers to handle the calls for service workload demand. In 2020, there was a deficit of 12 deputies. In 2021, based off of the calls for service, Sheriff Staley would need 150 deputies to respond to calls for service, the deficit being 24. In 2022, there would need to be 160, the deficit being 13. And in 2023, the calls for service needed would be 161, and the deficit today being 37. And the numbers do fluctuate, and that is a commitment to the boards that you have funded law enforcement officers each fiscal year. We have seen an increase to help calls for service, but as population increases, calls for service increases, and so therefore the demand of the deficit being 37. So this is just only one stop in our strategic roadmap and our alignment in working with in conjunction and collaboration. There is a decision point on the quality of level of law enforcement of service. There's a budget decision on equitable allocation of the deficit deputies. And our journey and endpoint would be to eliminate the deficit and maintain pace with future growth. So as for next step, there would be direction to city management and county administrator, the possibility of adopting a resolution for city and county level of service law enforcement of 308 calls for service per deputy sheriff per year, and the option to pursue various funding options. There's general fund, millage dedication, half-cent sales tax, and other options. And that concludes my presentation today. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Before we go on, I did fail to do a roll call, and I just want to make sure if we can go down the dais and everybody speak into the mic, and we'll go ahead and make sure everybody's accounted for. So, Ms. Hyder, if you would start from the left.
Yes,
and we'll
good
go to the
morning.
right.
Kathy Hyder, City Council, District 4.
Nick Klufis, University. Oh, no, I'm sorry. That's Monday Night Football. Nick Klufis, City Council, District 3.
There you go.
Good morning, Teresa Pontieri, District 2 City Council.
David Alford, Mayor, Palm Coast, President.
And Andy Dance, County Commission.
Leanne Pennington, Flagler County Commission.
Greg Hansen, County Commission, District 2.
Dave Sullivan, County Commission, District 3.
Donald O'Brien, County Commission, District 5.
All right, thank you very much. Sorry about that. I should have taken care of that earlier. So at this point, we'll open it up for questions. Did you have anything else you wanted to add, Sheriff Staley?
If you don't mind, Mr. Chair, excuse me. The one thing that I just want to make sure that you're very clear on as the discussion continues, we're talking strictly about law enforcement. What's not included in this study is the professional support. That's the 911 operators. It's the booking classification people in the jail. And it does not include the impact that growth has on the detention side. So what we're focusing on, because detention in the courthouse and that is statutorily required of the Board of County Commissioners. And so this focus of this study and analysis was for the law enforcement side. But as law enforcement grows, the community grows, there's impacts in other area. And of course, our dispatch center dispatches for everybody. So every 911 call comes in is fire or police by the city or the sheriff. So just keep that in mind.
Okay, great, thank you. Ms. Petita, did you have anything you wanted to add?
No, sir.
Okay, great. So at this point, we'll open it up for questions and comments from the dais. So
Question.
Mayor Alphen has started with, we're gonna have to raise these things. We don't have those little name placards, but go ahead, Mayor.
My question is just a couple of details. And Sheriff, that's a 54% reduction in crime, is that right?
Well, it's actually, the new terminology is more than 50% reduction in crime.
More than 50%.
Because unfortunately, when all the numbers are crunched for 2023, we did have a slight increase. And I would attribute that to growth. And we didn't add any deputies last year, we're only in the jail.
Okay, thank you. Ms. Johnson, the question I had was, you used a 24-hour period for the calculation for the arithmetic. I understand that. But my understanding is that calls for service oftentimes go beyond the 24-hour mark. And I don't know what happens when you hit that 24-hour period? Does that become an additional call for service, or it's the same call for service that rolls forward,
It's the same call for service, Mayor. And if you-
regardless of how long it is?
Correct. And if we go back to the previous slide where it calculated the minutes, it takes that average, right? So if it's longer than a 24-hour period, that would be added into the average.
But when it rolls forward, you're depleting resources of the rest of the deputies, right? Okay. And the other question was, with regard to those, and I think Sheriff, you were kind of speaking to this, the allocation hours. Can you just give us some, do you have an average number of support hours that are required for each of these service call deputies? In other words, they can't function alone, obviously, and I don't have a good feel for overall. I realize that every case is different, every call for service is different, but generally speaking, if you did the same gross generalized kind of arithmetic, what is the support factor?
So I'm going to let the chief of staff answer that because he was involved in this discussion and actually support staff was discussed. The only other thing that I want to point out is if you look at the slide of the population growth, we're already into 26 based on the 2023.
That was a comment I was going to make later, but yeah, it's already outdated, the growth numbers.
Correct, which skews the data a little bit. The data is never going to be perfect because there's always a lag in there, but I can remember in prior years when I would use data on population growth and the projections, I was told I was using the high end. Well, it turns out I was closer to accurate than what some reporters believed.
Mark Strobridge, Flagler County Sheriff's Office. Mayor, to answer your question, what we know is about 2.4 support people for every, 2.4 deputies needs one support person. So that's the ratio, 2.4 to 1, generally speaking.
An hour, so an hour service call requires 2.4 hours of support personnel.
Well, each 2.4 deputy sheriffs requires one support person.
Okay.
That's the easier calculation to run.
All right, that gives me a reference. Thank you.
Yes.
Mr. Chairman,
Yes, sir.
when you're calculating all these figures, do you include in the population of the county, the population of Bunnell and the population of Flagler Beach? And if you do you then count the police officers in Bunnell and the police officers in Flagler County? And if not, why not? Flagler Beach.
So the population total of Flagler County total includes the two small cities. The calculation of law enforcement does not, because they handle their calls as the law enforcement. The only role that we have in the sheriff's office is to support them occasionally on a major case like we just did with the city of Bunnell. But as far as the calculation of the factor of law enforcement officers in a jurisdiction, generally, I've never seen where the city is added to the county sheriff's office, and that's the ratio. The city, what typically happens, if you look at the city of Bunnell or the city of Flagler Beach, you'll find that their numbers skew the data because they'll have 4 to 5 officers per 1,000 residents because they're such a small city. But to do 24-hour coverage at a certain level, you're going to need at least 5 minimum. And generally, I think Flagler Beach has 15 or 16 and Bunnell has 12 or 14 officers. So the data actually gets skewed in the city.
But the 9/11 calls come into one source. Flagler Beach and Bunnell don't have their own 9/11 call center.
That's correct.
So
but-
total calls are what you put there in the briefing.
No, the total calls was the calls handled by the Flagler County Sheriff's Office,
Okay.
not the two cities.
Okay, so not.
And
so it
the
doesn't-
calls that come into the 911 center that are dispatched and so forth, like we don't do the two city police department records. We don't do their evidence. We don't do their CSI generally unless it's a major case and they request assistance. So that goes into the professional support factor of the 1.2 per 2.4 deputies. So that, now for the professional support side, clearly that is calculated in there that support those two agencies and the fire departments, I would add.
Mr. Chair.
Yes, sir.
So just, and I apologize, I'm a little slow maybe, and this is the first time I'm seeing this, but thinking about the big picture here, is this somewhat of a shift in your philosophy or thinking in terms of, I've read staffing studies in the past, but this seems like it's a hybrid methodology because you're looking at the calls for service and not just some of the traditional measures when you're looking at staffing that are related back to those specific list of crimes, correct?
Yes, that's correct, because the calls for service still have to be handled. So even though the crime rate is down, calls for service are going up, except for that one little dip that you saw. And so this is the hybrid model that was in the full study, when that one was done in 2022, if I recall correctly.
Right.
You received that in a budget request, I think, a couple of years ago. And frankly, that's a better model than using just population ratio for IACP or calls for service. So it's a blended model. And I will tell you that, these professors that do this, they came up with a blended model. It's actually been peer reviewed now and has been distributed across the country. And so it's a more, in my opinion, accurate. And then Lauren analyzed it like from one end to the other. So I don't know if you want to give your opinion on it, but that's mine.
I would just also be curious to see what the geographic dispersion is. So, and if it tracks with the population centers, or is it maybe skewed to, areas that you would not normally think it would be in the same percentages, if I'm asking, you understand me?
Sure. And for clarity purposes on the data, the report was for Palm Coast and Flagler County unincorporated. So City of Bunnell and City of Flagler Beach were not included in this data set that we're reviewing today. The mixed methodology is the preferred method over the other ones that they identified in this study. The workforce demand, the per capita approach, it really truly analyzes calls for service. And the reason I presented today the 24-hour shift is because based off the study's results, Sheriff Staley has, put in different shifts to command the calls for service and the volume. We can run reports that show where the call volume is. The Sheriff's Office has it broke down by different sectors. We don't have that here for you today, but that is something that we can provide.
Yeah, so that's what I was trying to understand is if the population of Palm Coast is 88% or whatever the number is does it track the same 88% of the calls are coming from there and then the rest from the unincorporated area or something different?
So we know based on our data that 82% of the calls for service, it's almost 83%, but 82 point something, the sheriff's deputies respond to is in the city of Palm Coast.
Commissioner Sullivan.
Right, just one on the additional deputies that are shown on the chart. It's, I think, 37 for right now. I think that was the number. Of those 37, do you include authorized deputies that have not, where the billet has not been filled yet, or are those not included in the additional number?
They're not funded, so they're not included.
So
So the 37, what's known as deficit deputies, is based on the current call volume and population. That is what we are short today, not including growth going forward.
So do we have any authorized deputy slots that are not filled right now because you're trying to hire people and things like that?
Yeah, I have six that are not filled right now, and then the others are in the academy, and we're processing people now
That
for
doesn't
those.
affect that 37 number is what I'm trying.
No,
Okay.
no, that is based on what you have authorized and based on the formula. And I just want to go back to the formula for a minute. The 308 calls for service, I just want to give you a comparison. The Orange County Sheriff's Office has used a similar formula and it's basically tied to their impact fee. And they're at 282 calls for service per deputy. So we're actually a higher expectation than Orange County and Orlando. And there's a couple other counties that do the same type of formula, and it's usually tied to the impact fee. And that formula in Orange County has been around since the late 80s or late 70s.
Commissioner Pennington.
No, I was able to read through the University of North Florida report, and I think we have to remember this because I have to remember it. Just the crime rate is not an indicator that we need a reduction in force. So you've got the calls are crime, but they're mental health, substance abuse, domestic issues, auto accidents. And really, quite honestly, if you look through it, what the gist of this is that growth needs to be serviced. The calls don't stop. The growth drives the calls. And so regardless of type of crime rate or anything like that, you're going to have the calls coming in. So he has to be properly staffed for that. So I think that's something we have to just wrap our brains around. And this is a good methodology, it appears, to talk about the amount of officers needing. So when I went through all of the data, if anybody didn't get it, it just basically states that you're going to have this sustained growth. So you're going to need to find a level of commitment to funding it in incremental ways so that you're keeping up with the growth. And that's really the gist of the entire data. It's not crime rate. It's not, you're making this push to continue growth in our county. So we need to keep up with the level of service that's required so that the crime doesn't get out of hand. So it's just important to remember that the calls that they're talking about today, 911 calls, are mental health, substance abuse, domestic, auto accidents, and all of that are into it. So those don't just go away when crime goes away.
Thank you. On this end.
Yes.
Councilwoman Pontieri.
Thank you. So Sheriff and Lauren, thank you for the presentation. I think that you all have leveraged the Real-Time Crime Center and technology in a very innovative and desired and should be sought after way to keep crime down, even though we've had population growth. So thank you for that, and thank you to your department. A couple questions on the data, and the first question I wanted to ask, piggybacking off of some of our commissioners, if the 308 number includes population, and I may be incorrect, so correct me if I'm wrong, includes population for Bunnell and Flagler Beach, but is not including their deputies, how is that accurate, or is it not including that?
It does not include population. It's a calls for service metric.
Okay, so when we're looking at the 308 calls for service,
It's for Flagler County and the city of Palm Coast.
only those doesn't, and it, so when we look at the other data points, because that chart showed the population included those two municipalities, right? But this formula does not.
Correct.
Okay, I wanted to be very clear on that. Thank you. Do we know what the average, I know you mentioned Orange County is a little bit lower, but have we looked at municipalities that are more similar to us in demographics to see what more comparable calls for service per deputy are? Because I don't find Orange County to probably be very comparable to us demographic-wise.
Well, even though that's my former agency, let's hope we never the hell get like Orange County
Yeah,
is
exactly.
today.
I
Okay.
second that.
But, because Orange County is problematic. It wasn't when I was there, by the way. I have it in a different type of matrix that I can provide. I don't have it with me today. But generally, here's what you find, is that municipal agencies have a higher ratio per 1,000 residents. And you see that across, frankly, the country, especially and specifically in Florida. So I can get that for you. But most agencies in a city, you're going to find that they're running 2.6, 2.8, 3.2 law enforcement officers per 1,000 residents. And it's because the cities have made a decision that they want a municipal level of service. And so that's why you see that. Typically in a sheriff's office in Florida, they're somewhere between 1.9 and 2.2 deputies per 1,000 residents is typically what I've seen in my career.
Okay. Yeah, I think that data, I would like to adopt a level of service because I know just in my short time being on city council, the public safety, both fire and police, has been always something that's in the back of my mind as far as the level of service we're going to provide and more importantly, fund. So to have a metric that we can consistently go by year after year rather than having to kind of get everybody together and do another presentation and look at all the data like this. Again, it takes a lot of resources and time that I appreciate you all putting into this. But I would like to, before we adopt that level of service, make sure that we're looking at comparable municipalities to see what others are doing and whether they're keeping the crime around the same rate with that number. I think that's important as well. And then the other question and data point I was curious about is the average time on scene. Do we know if our deputies are spending more time on scene than what is average or less?
Do you remember what the average time is? We have that data as part of the study.
We do, and to back up to your other question, this model is still a brand-new model that's out there, so there's not a lot of organizations that are actually looking at that particular metric of workload, and that's exactly what this model does, is the driving factor. And overall, what we know from the study is that we are about average on times on scene for service calls. And again, now, just to be clear, that includes from the time that it's received till the time that they're clear. The additional deputies that are on the scene at the same time are also added to that factor, so which also impacts the overall availability. And in this particular study, it was based on real world. What we're seeing today is 67.5% of obligated time. The ICP model, going back to what they also recommend 1/3, 1/3, 1/3. In other words, 1/3 obligated time, 1/3 of free time, and undirected patrol, which is community policing, and then 1/3 of administrative time. We're already well past the average of other organizations at the 67.5%. One of the decision points is, should we be at level of service where you saw 100% obligated time was like 20 deputies, what we currently have, all the way down to a 1/3 obligated time, which was well over 100 deputies to do the same task. So we did look at that as compared to other organizations, and the study looks at that as well. So, yes.
I'll give it to you in hours, because I think that's what you're looking for, okay? 12-hour shift is what a deputy works. the study found 67.5 of 12 hours, percent of 12 hours, they're obligated, handling calls, okay? That translates into basically 8.1 hours out of a 12-hour shift. The rest of the 12-hour shift, they get a lunch break, okay, at some point during that time. And the reason you don't want 12 hours of obligated time handling calls is because you then become strictly a reactive law enforcement agency and not proactive.
I agree with that 100%.
And so that's why, and then the question is how much non-obligated time do you want to fund? Frankly, that's the different percentages that you saw on the previous graph. So, and if you want them to have 90% obligated time, which I don't recommend, okay, then their proactive time goes down, but the number of deputies needed goes down. If you want them to have, like the ICP model, 33% obligated time, then the number of, and the rest not obligated, then that number of deputies skyrockets that none of us can afford, quite frankly. So I think we're trying to bring you a fair and balanced approach, depending on what level of service do you that fund the service want to provide your city in the county. And that's really what this is about. Now, there is we did, the staff, as they work together, did look at how do we get there, okay? Because first off, we know we can't just ratchet up 37 deficit deputies. None of us can afford it. Taxpayers don't want to pay it. And I probably couldn't find 37 deputies overnight because hiring is very, very difficult today. So the staff came up with a plan that, so how do you get rid of the deficit deputies and handle the growth that's already ahead of schedule? So for fiscal year 25, it would be 12 between the two entities. 26, 12, 27, 13, that catches you up, and then you're dealing with growth. 5 plus 5 and so forth as you go down, depending on the matrix of 308. And, and if calls for service drop, then that's a great thing. They might only need 3 deputies after you've caught up. And so there is a way to do it. And then the question comes, who pays what portion, right? And that's always been the sticky part when I try to negotiate contract between the City of Palm Coast and the Board of County Commissioners budget, because there is competing, let's say it what it is, there's competing interests here. The Board of County Commissioners, and feedback to me since I've been sheriff, thinks the city needs to pay more. The City of Palm Coast feels that the county should fund to some degree at least a basic level of service because of the ad valorem tax. And so that's why we're here, because I hear it from both of you, and the sheriff's right here in the middle, and I'm going, hey, I don't like this. Let's come up with a plan so that everybody knows it's easier for your county administrator and their staff and the budget staff, same thing with the city. If we can come to an agreement, but there's still, you got to figure out how to fund it. But if you can come to an agreement on what the ratio is, then everybody knows what the expectations are. And then if we have a downturn in the economy, okay, everybody understands that we have to come back together, and what the plan was may have to be adjusted. And I think we all understand that. But I think that's what we're trying to get to. And that's really the purpose behind the study and the joint city-county meeting.
Can I follow up just because we were talking about obligated time? So since we're short deputies currently, what is the current obligated time versus what we're proposing to be at?
We can run that calculation. This was the snapshot that we used at 67.5% at that particular time. And we were probably 3 or 4 down at that particular time as well. But we'll get a more accurate figure. I'm sure that it's higher now than it was as a result because we've had the growth. And of course, that's also been indicated that they don't have as much unobligated time in our slight increase to be omnipresent.
Right.
Mr. Chairman, let me just give you an example. This happened last Tuesday, so a week ago. I was in my car. I have a computer. Most of you have at least, been with me to some degree. Within a span of 7 minutes, and fortunately, it actually was occurring at shift change. We had 3 emergency calls back to back that required multiple cars to respond. One was an endangered missing person on Covert Lane. The other one was a fugitive that we were chasing. And right now I don't remember the other one. But we can't time them. So that's why you also have to have the unobligated time, because I will tell you on my computer screen, I didn't have one car available. Everybody was tied up on these 3 emergencies back to back to back. And on my computer screen, I can look at call lists and I can see what's holding. And so now we're holding calls because these are not, we probably searched and found this lady that was threatening suicide. It took an hour and a half, multiple units, bloodhound, drone, you name it, a lot of people there. And the fugitive was a lot of people to apprehend that individual. And unfortunately, I don't remember the other one was, but that's the concern.
Well, obligated time, if I'm not mistaken, correct me if I plays into being able to have backup. So there's a deputy safety factor involved in the obligated time, correct?
That is correct. And I think the reason we don't have the deputy involved shootings that you see in other jurisdictions around the country is because we are able to get a backup there. And offenders that may be armed that want to take on, unless they're just determined to do it, always take a calculated guess on whether or not they can get away with it. And by having a second deputy there, whether it's a domestic violence call, which can turn violent in a heartbeat, a traffic stop, does play into the safety factor of our deputy sheriffs. I know that personally.
Right. I have a last question, then I'll pass it on. So in this situation you described, where worst case scenario, you have a culmination of different effects, what's the plan when you need to pull deputies off? You don't have enough and you got to pull deputies from home. How do you do that?
Well, fortunately, we don't have to do that, but unless it's a very critical incident, like an active assailant or something like that, which thank God we haven't had. Hurricanes, we can kind of plan for. That's everybody on force. So what we do, let's say some critical incident happens, we go to what's known as Alpha Bravo. It's the entire agency's working 12-hour shifts, no days off. In a case that I think is more pointed to your question, like the Tuesday example I gave you, our supervisors and our watch commander, they're all handling calls too, by the way, but they will prioritize. So if a critical call comes in, we're going to find somebody to immediately respond. We're not going to have to call somebody out from home. But the non-priority calls, let's say a car crash, no injuries, let's say a Baker Act or some less than critical, they're going to hold. And they're going to wait until we have a deputy freed up to respond. And I can tell you it doesn't make residents happy when that happens, because our communications center has to then deal with people calling and saying, I called 45 minutes ago, where's the deputy sheriff?
Right.
And so we get those, but we try to explain to them, we have priority calls. And that's what every agency in America does, because you're never going to have perfect staffing.
At what point do you roll in the COPs?
We use them a lot, but remember they are volunteers.
Right.
And so generally they're not out at night. They're mostly in the daytime. But for minor traffic crashes, for example, We have them investigate it, the ones that are trained. Not every COP is trained to do traffic crash investigations. And they answer and handle 850, 900 traffic crashes a year, minor, mostly fender bender or minor stuff on the roads. So that's really already factored into these numbers.
And they take the responsibility of traffic management and stuff off of the deputies.
They do a lot, and that frees, and they do stuff that the community, for example, VIN verification. If you buy a vehicle out of state and you want to get it titled and tagged in Florida, the VIN has to be verified by a law enforcement officer. Well, some agencies use sworn deputy sheriffs or law enforcement officers to do that. That's not a good use of their time. I'd rather have them out doing proactive, enforcement. So the COPs can do that and they can notarize it and stuff. So it's things like that that we do as much as we can to take the burden off the deputies to free them up.
Okay, let me go back to this side. Mayor?
If I may, Ms. Johnston, I didn't hear the term special events mentioned yet, and the reason I ask is because as we grow, as a county, as a city, we're becoming an event-driven community, perhaps even a destination community for events, i.e. the Strawberry Festival as a recent example where I understand there were folks coming from counties all over the region. So the question I have is, how does that impact your manpower? We do have a calendar. These are not pop-up or surprise events, but just help me understand how that weighs in because it, I think, becomes a more significant component as we look forward.
Well, currently how we do it is because of our plan, we can plan in advance. So we'll put appropriate staffing and additional staffing out through my budget, through the existing budget generally. Sometimes there is the requirement for off-duty employment, depending off-duty deputies to work it as an extra detail. So it's kind of a combination of both. But we also, all these events go through our Homeland Security section to be vetted for any threats. So there is a pretty significant impact on these events internally leading up to the actual event and then the day of the event. So every event is different. And so we might have deputies on bicycles. If we can use on-duty deputies, we do that. If not, depending on the size, then we have off-duty deputies or overtime.
But you can reach into, I guess, your off-duty staff in order to make up that difference.
Yes, but let me tell you what happens with today's Zennial and the younger millennials. They want their time off. They don't want to work overtime. It's not like when I was a young deputy sheriff and I had to work overtime just to pay the bills. Their interest is more in time off. So there are times that residents try to hire off-duty deputies and for whatever they're having, and no one picks it up. And I can't control that. That's not their job. That's the extra. And it's just a different employee atmosphere today.
Yeah, cultural. Yeah.
Councilman Clufus?
Sure. Thank you very much for the presentation. My questions were revolving around how the COPs were playing into the process, but I think that was explained. Now, the city and the Flagler County Sheriff's Office have done a tremendous job collaboratively working together, for instance, the Real-Time Crime Center. And I think one of our biggest, the absence of an expectation for the last, previous years of a level of service, I think is what has surprised a bunch of council members during budget season. And it's really having expectation management, if we can all agree upon a level of service that needs to be maintained, I think is the best thing for city councils going forward. It'll definitely ease the budgetary process. My question is, are there any infrastructure related programs or improvements that the city can prioritize that will enable the Flagler County Sheriff's Office to operate at a more effective level, such as the video cameras for the Real-Time Crime Center? Are there infrastructure projects that could potentially lead to a force multiplier while we try to close the deficit for additional deputies being needed?
As far as the force multiplier component, I think we've reached the saturation fact for that. because when a resident calls, they want a deputy. They want that call handled. And, you know, if you're reading the news around the country, Pittsburgh Police Department is not even responding to in-progress calls anymore. None. And I don't think that's what our community wants. Because once you go down that path and you lose the crime reduction gains that we have had since I've been your sheriff, you'll never get it back. It's the same thing with gangs and stuff like that. Once they take hold, that's it. You're done. Just all you got to do is look around. So I don't think there's the technology now makes the deputy more effective. For example, we had a burglary of a commercial home under construction. It was reported the next morning. In fact, this is this week. Still an active investigation. Normally, you would have zero clues to go on. You just know they lost all the appliances on the home under construction, and they generally don't have serial numbers. But because of our real-time crime center and frankly the partnership with the city of Palm Coast, where we record your traffic cameras, we found the vehicle. And then through our technology, we were able to get the tag number. So now we have leads that will be able to solve this case. So now that's our detectives doing the follow-up with our real-time crime center. So I think it makes it more effective. But I think we're at the point now where you got to have people answer the calls.
I completely concur. I think technology is one place where you're never going to be able to replace a deputy. So I believe in our staff and the working collaboration between both departments that if there's anything that the city can ever do as far as obligations for infrastructure or installation of technology to make your force more effective, I think that you have support from all of us. So thank you.
And Councilmember Clufus, we do reoccurringly meet with the sheriff's office and plan our future facilities around technology, looking at safety practices. How do we make sure the facilities are hardened the proper way while we're under the design phase of it? And as we look forward to the future and future growth, we look at co-locating facilities, et cetera, as we move forward.
Now, on piggyback on that, I want to make sure that we recognize everybody here that participates in the Community Traffic Safety Team program, because that program is what helps us reduce some of those incidents. So Sergeant Biss is very active in giving us recommendations to the transportation engineers on problematic intersections and retiming or changes in signalization and turn lanes, which has happened. Those suggestions have resulted in Bulldog Drive and 100 being programmed differently to reduce accidents with the yellow light. So those are, kudos to everybody working together to reduce incidences, which help, you be able to, the deputies be more proactive, as you said, then they have time to be proactive in the community.
Yeah, that's a good point, Mr. Chair. And if I could, I'd go back to Councilman Clufus for infrastructure. The one thing I have mentioned to the mayor is that as the west side development occurs, there will need to be a district office like we have on Old Kings Road for the city of Palm Coast. That's not today, it's not tomorrow, but it has to be planned for, and the cost of that, because your population is going to be huge there.
Go back to this side. Any other follow-up? Commissioner Sullivan?
There are lots of things involved with safety and security. We're really focusing on the percentages for deputies and all that. I mean, you can talk about the jail, you can talk about the district offices and all that kind of thing. It's all part of the overall structure. That's not what we're focusing on here today. Just to make that point.
If I may, I just, I want to reiterate the fact that, and emphasize the fact that I agree we need a standard level of service that we can continuously fall back on so that we can budget and plan for the future in a consistent way. Once, I think some of the data points that you indicated you could get to us, that would be really helpful. And I don't know what the appetite is to come to a unified level of service between the county and the city, but I, at the very least, hope that our city council is willing to adopt a resolution after we get some of those data points and have a more in-depth conversation based on those so that we can, per resolution, adopt something that we can continuously fall back on and that future city council can fall back on and rely on so that when we come up with the budget every year, we're not caught off guard and we can budget for all of public safety, including fire and police. So I thank you for this idea and this initiative, and I think that this is the best way to kind of put us on a consistent path forward. And to Commissioner Pennington's point, we are growing. So we need these data points. We need to make sure we're making these decisions not based on arbitrary figures, but based on what you all feel every single day. So thank you for this.
Councilwoman
Are we
Hyder?
on? Okay. First, I'd like to thank you, Lauren, and also Sheriff Staley and Officer Stolberg for the wonderful presentation. There was a lot of information, very relevant to what we need as a council right now, and also the Flagler County Commission. I think that one of the things that concern me, and I think concerns everyone here, is the amount of growth that we're dealing with in Flagler County and the city of Palm Coast right now. That's a major issue. So I'm concerned right now. Are we going to have the number of officers in the sheriff's department that we're going to need to accommodate the growth of this city?
If you authorize and fund it, we'll hire them.
Okay, that was going to be my next question. So, seeing that, okay, taxpayers may not want to fund the police officers. I'm not one of them. I'm all for funding our first responders, our firefighters. I think that they are one of the most important parts of our community, and we need them. So you mentioned that it's difficult to hire deputies. What is the most difficult part of being able to hire new deputies right now, other than taxpayers not wanting to fund it?
The competition between the other agencies. Because, for example, right now, the Orange County Sheriff's Office has over 200 vacancies, and you see that everywhere. I don't know what currently Volusia has. St. John's County Sheriff's Office just told me in this next fiscal year, he's getting 25 new positions funded. It's already done. Not formally in his budget yet, but that's been the discussion. And so there's 25 right there. So what we've done, and the only reason I'm down a few, is that we go out of state. The governor has a plan, what they call EOT, equivalent of training, and they give an incentive. So we've hired a number of out-of-state people. The other thing that we're doing, so prior to no one wanting to go into law enforcement because of a variety of reasons, mostly media generated, in some high-profile incidents around the country, we would only hire people that were already certified. So in other words, they had their state requirement. I could hire them, put them right in our internal training, and get them out on the street in about four months. Today, what I'm having to do is hire completely green recruits, cadets almost, pay for them to go to the academy, pay them a salary while they're in the academy. That's 880 hours. Then they come out, they have to learn all of our policies and procedures and our de-escalation tactics and all the stuff that we teach them. Then they're paired with a deputy. So by the time you've done all of that, it's 10 to 12 months when you include the background processing and so forth. So when you fund a deputy today, it's 10 to 12 months before you physically see that deputy handling calls by themselves. The reason the EOT is good is because they don't have to go through the full 880-hour academy. if they're certified, that the state will accept, because there's some states that their training is not to the standards that Florida will accept. As long as their training is Florida accept, they go through a 2-week course and they go right into our training. That's why we try to focus on the EOT. So we're doing both things. And I'll give you an example. I just had some work done. It just shows you the difficulty of hiring today. I had Dish come out to my house because I had built a barn and I was adding TVs in my barn. And I'm talking to this young man and I said, hey, is this what you want to do, you know, for the rest of your life? Is, you know, he had to dig a 200-foot, you know, line to bury from my house to the barn. And he goes, well, you know, I make pretty good, but I have been thinking about, you know, becoming a firefighter. And I said, well, you know, I pay you to go to the academy. Here's what my starting pay is and all of that. He goes, no one wants to be a cop today because they're not respected. And this was a 20-year-old individual, 20-ish somewhere, and that's what we're competing with. And then you're competing with the agencies like St. John's Fast Growth. He's getting 25 new deputies. And before that, they put school resource deputies in every school instead of using the Guardian program. So it was however many hired for that. Volusia County, same thing. Daytona, same thing. But we're holding our own, and I'm proud of that. But we've had to change our entire hiring process. And let me just say that when we send them and they go to the academy, they have to sign an agreement. If they fail that academy or after they graduate and I swear them in, if they don't stay with us for 4 years, they have to pay everything back. Because I don't want to train them and then they go to St. Johns County that's paying more for me than I can afford to pay.
So all of that makes a lot of sense. It takes a lot to get a new deputy on the street also.
Please recruit for me, all of you. Send them
So,
my way.
I guess the
Join
next-
FlaglerSheriff.com.
Yeah. So what is it that we can do as a commission and as a council to help our sheriff's department?
Well, I think this is a good step. I think some decisions need to be made at some point, maybe not today, because there's been some requests for some additional information. But I think what's really needed is the formula. And that way, both bodies know exactly what the expectations are. And if I were to I'll just throw this out. Staff may kill me for saying this, but let's say that the formula says that to try to erase some of the deficit, and based on the formula, you need 10 deputy sheriffs. If 80% of the service is in the city of Palm Coast, then that may mean that the city of Palm Coast pays for 8 of those deputies and the county pays for 2. The county's also going to need to pay for the impact in the jail for deputies and the impact in the 911 center and so on and so forth. Or the question might be okay, for the county, what is the base level of law enforcement services that you want to provide countywide? And in the city's current contract is an enhanced level of service for the city of Palm Coast. So if you're trying to erase the deficit at 10, then maybe the city is 6 and the county is 4 because of the base level. Those are all decision points to be made. And then once those decision points are made, then you can figure out what's the formula for funding it. Now, some of that can be impact fees, can't pay salary, but it can pay the cost of the vehicles, the equipment, the radio, that kind of stuff. If the impact fees are set at the appropriate level to cover the impact that growth is having. So there are ways to offset at least the initial hiring for additional staff, where it's not on the back of ad valorem or it's not on the back of sales tax 100%.
And Sheriff, that was one of my questions too, spurred by Councilwoman Hyder's questions. because of the extra steps we're having to take to bring on deputies, what is the price point for training for that first 10 to 12 months alone? Not the ongoing salary and benefits, but that initial cost.
So that initial cost to get them completely through the training to where they're free is not any cheaper than a deputy sheriff first year if they were fully trained. Actually, it's a little bit more because you got to pay the academy.
So, yeah, and I guess my question is to including uniforms, vehicle, fully involved, what are we
So they
looking at?
wouldn't have the vehicle while they're in training, but I can tell you for a fully prepared deputy who can get in a car and go handle a call is $146,000.
Okay.
That includes car, everything. When they're in the academy, that's going to be reduced because they don't have a car. They're using the academy firearms, stuff like that. So, and I'm just going to guess it, but I'm going to guess that then reduces to about 70, 80,000 a year, but it's a percentage of that because they're not in the academy for a whole year. And once they get sworn in as a deputy sheriff, that's when they get their car and everything else. So, there is a buildup, if you
Sure.
will.
Thank you.
So my other question is, well, not so much a question, a comment. I want to thank you for the program that you have set up in the prisons where the inmates are able to take classes to help them once they come back out and they become is recidivism. What are the stats on that program? How is that working? What is the statistics?
Well, I can tell you, Councilwoman, that for those that take our program and are successfully in the program, that the average recidivism rate is only 33%. I just did a presentation on this. Whereas, and you might say, well, that sounds high. But without that, the national studies show recidivism between 66 and 73%. So it has great success for those that take advantage of it.
Absolutely. And my last question is, where mostly are the crimes that you find that our city has to deal with? Where are most of the crime calls? I know we have a drug busts that go on all the time, but where else do you find more of the focus of the crimes that are committed or the calls that our sheriff's department is called on?
Well, there's no neighborhood that is immune. Let me put it that way. Now, I will tell you that some of the gated communities are as close to immune as you can get for property crime, but domestic violence still occurs, okay? So what I would tell you is that we're very fortunate. It's very rare that we have a violent crime, although we just had one at the Circle K in Palm
Yeah, I
Coast
saw that.
with a stabbing. And again, that was our real-time crime center that gave us ultimately the suspect's name. So that's a rare event. We quickly fortunate that we've made arrests on this stuff. The crimes that we're seeing the most of are property crimes. If all of our residents would lock their car doors, then we could work and reduce that crime because quite often it's a crime of opportunity. And that's the downside effect of having a safe community because when people feel safe, they don't do their own crime prevention stuff. And then the other, in the high construction that we're having right now, we are having construction thefts that count as burglaries today. Under the federal guidelines for NIBINS, which is the National Incident-Based Reporting System, which they just implemented a year and a half ago. It changed the definition of everything, so you can't compare what you did before to today because it's completely different. But you have a house that's under construction, doesn't have windows, doesn't have doors, might not even have a roof, and somebody goes inside that where a door would be, or a garage door, and they steal something, it's a burglary. Whereas before in my career, that was a larceny. So, things like that. So we are seeing those kind of thefts. So those are the two main areas.
Thank you very much. So I just want to say thank you so much for all that you do for the community and your staff and all your officers. You do an amazing job, and I am hoping that we are able to find a way to properly fund our police department.
Well, thank
So
you. And
much.
I do want to commend my team. You know, I get to set the vision and the tone of the agency, but they carry out the directions. And they're the ones that have delivered this crime reduction. It wasn't me. We all worked together because you helped fund it and you helped increase the staffing, which took us from a totally reactive agency to now relatively proactive in a technology. So it all works hand in hand. It's just not me. So thank you.
Mayor.
So just, Rick, just a last question here. I think you opened the door, Councilwoman Hyder. It's very hard to get them. So if you just comment very briefly, how hard is it to keep them? In other words, that's got to be an issue as well. We really haven't spoken about that.
So we look at that. I'm a data-driven sheriff, and we know that if we can keep them here for 5 years, they're not going anywhere.
Okay.
Our turnover is between the 0 and 4.9, basically. And so what's causing the turnover? Well, let's go back to the Zennials again. They think this is what they want to do, and then they get in it, and I just had this happen. We sent her to the academy, did everything. Her family did not really support her, okay? I think Dad specifically was extremely concerned about the potential dangers of law enforcement. And ultimately, he won. But here's what we did. Now, she still has to pay us back, by the way, because we sent her to the academy and did all that. But now she's a 911 operator. So we didn't lose her 100%, okay? And of course, her pay changes and stuff like that. So it's things like that. Complete career changes, okay? It's not leaving from one agency going to another agency. They just decide, we just had this happen. I can make more money in my family's mortgage broker business than being a detective. And so I just lost a deputy to that. So
Okay.
it's a variety of things. We know right now that our turnover rate for this year is less than 5%, which is good in the industry. I wish it was lower, but it's
And
good.
do you foresee the State Guard being a target-rich environment for recruitment?
Well, we're certainly hoping for that. That's one of the reasons why I went to their most recent graduation.
Okay.
And I know that there were 2 guardsmen from Flagler County, from actually the city of Palm Coast, that graduated. So, you know, as long as they're not stealing my people, but it's not full-time, so I think I'm okay there.
I have one more question. You mentioned that property crimes are more or less the highest rate of crimes that are happening. What can we do to communicate to our community how we can help to prevent these property crimes?
Well, every time you're talking or have a town hall meeting, tell them to join us to keep our communities safe and enjoy the safe environment by locking your car doors. Report suspicious activity to the sheriff's office. We take all of those important, but that also goes back to the reason for this meeting, because when you call and report something suspicious that you saw, you want a deputy there now, or that person or individual car, or whatever is going to leave. So that's why we need that built-in proactive time too.
Thank
But
you very much. I have a town hall that I'm going to be doing on April 19th, and I'm going to make sure that I share that with them.
and
Thank you so much.
Please let them know to join FlaglerSheriff.com too.
Back on the right side over here, anybody else?
No, Chair, I was actually just going to recommend that we go back through and kind of at a high level what everyone needs to make a decision on the formula piece of this. And then I would recommend, deciding now how we're going to follow back up on that and meet again and discuss the formula in totality and the funding mechanisms for it, because I would like to see that happen prior to August, to be honest with you, before, so we don't have to repeat this again.
All right, so next steps, did you keep track of the comments and some of the additional information that were needed?
Yes, sir.
Okay. And what do you need from us moving forward based on today's meeting? Are we going to follow up with a second meeting?
So I'm hearing kind of a couple of different things. I'll try and summarize the best that I can. The county administrator and City of Palm Coast staff will work together and with the sheriff's office on some data that is requested. We will work together on a draft resolution to bring to you at a future meeting. It's to your pleasure whether that wants to be another joint session or if we are at individual workshops. And that's what I'm hearing so far as next steps. Do you hear anything else, Ms. Petito?
No, Lauren, I think you've captured everything. The only comment that I would probably add is once we get those data points back, that maybe it's an opportunity to maybe reconvene and kind of look at that in case there's additional questions from both boards.
Okay, I know the hardest part is finding a date for everybody, but I'm sure we'll come up with something. I guess if there's any other as people come up with additional questions, just send them to the administrators and let them continue. Because there's a couple that I didn't hit on, but they're very minor and we can follow up with them at a later date. Commissioner Hanson.
Yeah, on the funding, we haven't really talked about funding issues on here, but Mr. Mayor, you guys bombed the half-cent sales tax before we even got to discuss it. Or you still feel that same way?
Sorry, say that again?
I said your council vetoed the half-cent sales tax before we even had a chance to discuss it. Do you still feel that way?
I have to jog my memory. I don't remember that becoming before city council during my term.
I don't believe the mayor was on council whenever that was brought previously.
So I'm going to pass your bomb back. Certainly at this point in time, I would be open to discussions. Yeah, that really predates me, Greg. So yeah, I think that we should have that discussion.
Yeah, because that would solve a lot of problems, especially for you, solve a lot of problems.
Anything to put out a bomb.
Well, I know we're both heavy in budget discussions right now, so I think we'll each need to go back with staff and look at the budget implications this year. And then I think ultimately a long-term funding solution is probably in the cards.
Right. We look at this as two categories, right? One is funding future growth and creating that metric, and that's the draft resolution that we can work together on. And then we can also work together on identifying, Sheriff Staley identified we had a plan, right? It could be 12 this year, 12 next year, et cetera. What does that look like as a team, as equitable share, and then provide that to the boards as next steps?
If I may, on the funding, I appreciate you, Commissioner Hinton, bringing up the half-cent sales tax because I agree. I think it could serve us well and solve a lot of problems. I especially am concerned about some of the things that recently just came through the state legislature that has some pretty strong and highly potential impacts on our ad valorem. So in order to make the best use of everybody's time here, perhaps on the individual board levels, we look at these supplemental data points that are coming our way and we talk internally at workshops on what the budget implications can be and possible resolution, come up with consensus prior to reconvening here so that we can come back saying our board has consensus to move forward in this direction. What do you have consensus for? And then that way we can actually walk away with some deliverables and resolution moving forward, because we are kind of on a timeline now, right? We're looking at our budgets and we don't know what property values are going to do. They could go up. It's potential that they will go up and that maybe our current ad valorem won't be hit, but it certainly probably will next year. So I think that we're definitely on a timeline. So I hope that we can, like I said, separately make some good decisions, come up with consensus, and then reconvene, bringing that consensus to this joint committee.
Mr. Chairman.
Yes, sir.
Yeah, just to jump on board on that would be my point, that like it or not, the budget becomes the big dog in the room eventually, and we deal with that every year. But going into the future right now, after 2 or 3 years of heavy inflation and what the state legislature has done this year and how the impact that's going to be, we're going to have to look at there's got to be some way to fund what we've been briefed on today, and right now, it's not there.
And just for posterity, I was part of the minority that did recommend passing along the recommendation for that half-cent sale tax, just for posterity.
So Chair, could
Yes, sir.
we
Yes, ma'am.
maybe pass to the administration to keep in mind to provide us some information factoring in options to fund what the half-cent sales tax millage dedication would look like up against the current legislation if it passes as well? So that we can get an idea of, when we're talking about the homesteading, right? So what does that look
Right.
like to the impact of the budget in the future year? What would plugging it back with a half-cent sales tax look like? And then how much dedication of that from your municipality would come back into the county to help us continue to fund this
And I think it's
operation?
also important for our friends in the media to understand a few things. One, that when we look at the half-cent sales tax, it's not just for the sheriff's office, it's for public safety. So it's fire and police. And two, a large percentage of that will be paid by out-of-towners and visitors, and they impact our crime, right? So we need to make sure that as we are looking to fund public safety in general, it's not resting on just the shoulders of our residents. And I think this is a really fair way to make sure that those who are coming into our county and committing crime are also helping to pay for it in some way. So I think this is a really good option, but to have those data points before our next meeting, I think is very helpful and will help us make some pretty tough decisions.
And fleshing out the other options. I mean, the top two are just not the only options. There could be other options, MTSUs, other funding mechanisms that are out there. I think we need to look at all of them, look at other best practices from around the state on how they're doing it as well.
So Chair Dance, just to summarize and get consensus, county administrator, sheriff's office, and City of Palm Coast leadership team will work collaboratively together over the next couple of months, or hopefully over the next month, get some data points together, some draft resolution for a future call for service metric that identifies for growth, run some scenarios to have with you at a future presentation and meeting on millage dedication, what it means for the state legislature requirements, the half-cent sales tax, and other options. And I know that the budgets are typically due May 1st, and so we'll work together to have you something hopefully slightly after.
Okay. Any other final comments? All right, seeing none, we will open it up for public comment. I want to recognize Mr. Freeman, Mr. Willingham. You were trying to be back there without any attention, but want to recognize you for being here. If you had any comments, I'll open it up for public comment. You're welcome to come up and say anything on behalf of the district, but you're good. Okay. So is any other public comment? All right, seeing none, we'll go ahead and close public comment. Sheriff Staley, did you have anything final?
I was just going to tell you, thank you for the robust discussion. I think it's been a good meeting, and the hard work's yet to come, but I think it's a good start, so thank you.
All right, thank you. Thank you, Chief Strobridge. Thank you, Lauren. Thank you, Ms. Petito, for everybody putting everything together. We'll go ahead. Do you have a motion to adjourn?
Second.
All right, motion second. Thank you, everybody. Meeting is adjourned.